In the autumn of 2014, you'll be asked to decide whether Scotland should become an independent country. It could be the most important vote you'll ever cast. The future of Scotland won't be decided by politicians in Hollywood or here in Westminster. It'll be decided by you. Thanks. The people who live and work here and call Scotland home. So stay with us here on STV as we explore how Scotland has moved from being at the very heart of the Union in 1945 to today, preparing for a referendum on independence.
This is a historic opportunity to mobilise our natural and human resources to build a very special society here in Scotland.
I think Scotland would be better off in the United Kingdom, I do think that, but I think the United Kingdom would be so much worse off without Scotland.
There was a way in which the version of Scotland as British wasn't contested.
What I do remember feeling is a sort of cringe about being Scottish.
Come on then.
And the way I spoke.
What a put it.
This is the first barrel of crude oil to come out of the North Sea.
Mrs. Thatcher, stick your poll tax up your...
And then Aberdeen voted for tax raising powers, which clearly indicated I thought the writing was on the wall.
I would vote for independence for no other reason than just to never have to take part in something like Iraq ever again.
The Parliament has created a newfound confidence and a refreshed sense of identity.
There will be no babying.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
The warrant fail is cancelled.
The Scottish Parliament is hereby reconvened.
All over Britain, like here in Dumbarton in 1945, people took to the streets to celebrate the defeat of Hitler. Rarely had the kingdom felt more united. That feeling of unity was enhanced when Clement Attlee's Labour government won a stunning landslide victory over the wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill on a promise of lasting peace and cradle-to-grave welfare provision. British socialism's time, it seemed, had come.
I remember the day that Attlee was elected in 45, my father and a miner's wife who stayed beside us dancing up and down the path. I mean, it was a wonderful thing. We really believed that socialism could cover from John O'Groats to Land's End.
Despite devolution being on their manifesto, Attlee's government had no interest in a Scottish Assembly. Not only were there more important things to do, but there was almost no demand for Home Rule from the Labour Party in Scotland.
It was a perfectly logical and sensible argument. They believed in the solidarity of the British people and of the working class British people.
You have to remember that everybody who was in politics at that time had come through a war. And I think people regarded nationalism as, well, it was just irrelevant.
It certainly seemed an irrelevance to Scotland's partygoers as they celebrated the first peaceful Hogmanay in 7 long years with the sensational new sound of Jimmy Shan's dance band. Scots were comfortable with their dual British and Scottish identity and saw no need for constitutional change. In the 1940s, the idea of Scotland becoming independent was about as real as Brigadoon, the play taking Broadway by storm. Scottish independence was the stuff of fantasy, largely confined to the outer limits of the political spectrum.
It was viewed with, I suppose, a mixture of contempt and amusement, certainly not taken seriously, regarded as a bit of a lunatic fringe of politics, colourful but no threat at all.
Occasionally, campaigns for Home Rule did make the headlines. In 1948, the Glasgow lawyer John McCormick set up the National Covenant, a petition calling on the government to establish a Scottish Assembly. It was signed by almost half of Scotland, but it disappeared quickly as none of the political parties lent it their support. Then a trio of Glasgow University students decided on more direct action and planned a daring cross-border raid.
A Christmas Day sensation at Westminster Abbey. The Stone of Destiny, which had been there for some 600 years, was stolen from the coronation chair.
Ever since the ancient sandstone block on which all Scottish kings had been crowned was taken to London in 1296 by Edward I, Scots patriots had planned to get it back.
You can see how the thieves tore it out, smashing parts of the chair in the process.
The student gang were led by Ian Hamilton, a former wartime RAF volunteer who'd conceived his plan while on leave in London.
I had had a look at it when I was in the forces, and I thought, you know, this place doesn't look as though it's guarded at all. It shouldn't be all that difficult.
But 4 days of intensive police work brought no definite clue.
Although the police hunted high and low for these cross-border raiders, criminal charges were always unlikely.
We were never prosecuted because the people of Scotland wouldn't have stood for it. The Home Secretary got up in the House of Commons and said that we know who the vulgar vandals are, but it would not be in the public interest to prosecute them. They just feared to prosecute us.
Now, 3 months after, the scene shifts to Arbroath Abbey in Angus, where the stone was handed to the custodian.
The stone was taken from Arbroath and returned to Westminster Abbey, where 3 years later it was back in position for the coronation of Elizabeth Mountbatten, when she was crowned Queen Elizabeth. This was the peak of post-war Britishness. But in Scotland, the debate over whether the Queen was Elizabeth I or II cost the life of many a good pillar box as radical nationalists took out their frustration on the post office.
Later on, the great Maurice Blythmore writing his song about it, you know. Nae Liz the one, nae Lilibet the twa, nae Liz will ever day. Well, Mackled Land Republican and the Scottish breakaway. In 1953, that was all the rage to blow up a postbox.
The leader of the Scottish Patriots recalls their 1953 tactics.
First of all, we covered the numeral with pitch, and that was taken off. And then this member of ours cracked it from top to bottom, the whole way down, so that it was just about ready to fall apart. That didn't stop them, so it was quite understandable when others said, look, these things have failed, come on, a wee bit of gelignite.
In the 1950s, Britain was enjoying the fruits of a post-war economic boom. The hugely popular slum clearances offered a chance for thousands of Scots families to escape the inner city. Full employment meant that affordable seaside holidays to places like Portobello and Musselburgh were now within the reach of just about every worker. And the new National Health Service would even be on hand to treat the sunburn afterwards. In the 1950s, Scottish nationalism appeared to be a complete irrelevance.
Oh no, I don't think many people actually had any interest in independence. And those who did, it was very much the romanticised notion of one day Scotland will be free. And the question was, well, from what and for what?
Scotland, like the rest of Britain, was a two-party state. You were either Labour or Conservative. In the general election of 1955, the chances are that in Scotland, you'd be a Conservative.
The Tory party in 1955 spoke for half of Scotland. Scotland was quite deferential and shaped by authority, and so people did what their peers did or did what their parents did, and that aided a kind of sense of there being a Tory vote.
What also aided the Tory vote in the 1950s was the potent mix of religion, identity and politics.
There was in Scotland, particularly the west of Scotland, a working class, not conservative, but unionist vote, orange vote, because of the Catholic-Protestant divide. But essentially it was a working class vote that was doing so for sectarian reasons.
The Orange Order at that point voted Conservative. There was discrimination, for example, in the shipyards in Glasgow, where Protestants were always given priority for higher echelon jobs than Roman Catholics.
The election of 1955 was to provide the high watermark for the Orange vote in Scotland. The world was changing, Britain was changing, and Scotland was being swept along.
It disappeared for many reasons. Religion becomes less important, so you vote more on class lines. If you're working class and you live in Glasgow, you begin to be more likely to vote Labour. Empire falls away. And what also happens is Scotland becomes more of a disputatious, argumentative society.
Perhaps the new wave of American cinematic imports that had Scots flocking to the picture halls in the mid-50s contributed to the changes. Scots youngsters could model themselves on the leather-clad motorcycle gang leader Marlon Brando, or rebel against authority like Natalie Wood and James Dean. But it wasn't just the movies that were causing a stir.
Rock and roll was the biggest change that ever came, really. That changed everything for a lot of people. So yeah, the change was in the air, you could tell.
Bill Haley and his Comets were mobbed and then copied by teenage fans from the minute they set foot in the country. For the first time ever, teenagers didn't dress like smaller versions of their parents. For the young, the changes of the 1950s were obvious. For the older generation, it would take something altogether more dramatic. In the mid-50s, Britain still saw itself as a world superpower. The Suez Crisis changed that forever.
Sir Anthony said, Britain and France have called upon Egypt and Israel to stop all warlike action forthwith.
Without asking America's permission, Britain invaded Egypt to seize control of the Suez Canal and overthrow Egyptian President Nasser, who'd nationalised it.
The US said to Britain, we'll cut off your money supply unless you pull out, and Britain pulled out immediately.
The 1st Battalion, the Yorks and Lancs, who'd recently been holding the front line at El Cap, are already on their way home together with other units.
The Suez Canal was, for me, like a kind of full stop on the fantasy that stayed in some British heads, that they still had the kind of clout and the kind of authority that it had before the war.
Suez was the break, wasn't it? I wrote in my little book that Elvis and Suez arrived more or less in the same month, you know, and that really was the end of the British Empire.
After Suez, it was Britain's turn to be invaded. This time, no one asked them to leave. Elvis even set foot in Scotland, albeit for just a few minutes, on his way back home after a stint in the army. In the late 50s, Scottish Home Rule was on virtually no one's agenda. Well, it was on the Labour Party's 1958 conference agenda, but only so it could be formally removed as party policy. Scotland's position in the North Atlantic made her strategically important in the late 50s, and that guaranteed the arrival of another American import, one that divided public opinion and even acted as a recruiting sergeant for the beleaguered nationalists.
My real interest at that point was in banning the bomb. You know, in 1961, Polaris came to the Clyde, and I was more interested probably in that. The SNP has always been anti-nuclear, and so that seemed like another good reason for joining the SNP.
Opposition to Polaris may have given the SNP credibility, but in the 1960s, what they really needed was votes. In the decade ahead, a faltering Scottish economy was to provide the means to get them. In 1961, as Polaris came up the Clyde, the Scottish economy, it seemed, was headed down the Swanee, with coal mining, shipbuilding and steelmaking all in long-term decline. The national football team wasn't far behind. This 9-3 hammering by England being a particularly painful experience.
Bobby Smith got goal number 9. Oh, it's terrible.
But sometimes a defeat can, with hindsight, be seen as a triumph. Take the West Lothian by-election the following year. Tam Dalyell held the seat for Labour, but for him it was the defeated SNP that was the real story.
At a fairly early stage in the by-election, I said, look, I think the Scot Nats are going to get 10,000 votes, because one could smell this coming.
There was something bubbling underneath at that point, and so it was obvious that there was something changing, but it was a very slow change.
The Scottish economy was certainly changing, unfortunately for the worse, and lagging behind the rest of the UK. In an attempt to reverse the decline, the Tory Prime Minister Harold Macmillan told the very successful Midlands car manufacturers that if they wanted to expand production, they'd have to move their operation north of the border. Under duress, Roots headed to Scotland to make the Hillman Imp.
And on the appointed day, His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh visits Linwood to mark the official opening of a great industrial project.
But the local workforce had no experience in building cars, and crucially, all the component suppliers and the precision engineering works were still based in the Midlands. So every night, trains laden with imps left Linwood to be completed in the Midlands before being returned to Linwood for their final assembly. An expensive and ultimately unsustainable 600-mile round trip. And here is the very first of almost 500,000 imps to roll off the production line between 1963 and 1976. But forcing car manufacturers to move to where the government wanted them to go was never going to work in the long term. And the Scottish economy continued to falter, and Scottish unemployment continued to rise. In the 1964 general election, Labour's Harold Wilson was elected Prime Minister. In Scotland, the Tory support was on the slide. They'd lost over 10% of their vote in under a decade.
The Scottish Conservative Party was not very firmly led. I used to go to the Scottish Party conferences, and I always enjoyed it, but I always felt that they were 30 or 40 years out of date.
Scotland looked to the incoming Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson to be bang up to date and to deliver on his promise of a dynamic new future. Wilson's election was the cause of great optimism in Scotland. As the 60s started to swing, the cultural icons were young and most definitely British. And no one typified the optimism of the mid-60s more than the Beatles, who even popped into STV for a chat with a couple of starstruck presenters.
I've got Paul and John.
John.
And Paul's talking to George and Ringo, the other two. In those days, yeah.
Mainstream Scotland was culturally British in the 1960s, to a degree that seems almost unimaginable today.
There was once a Scottish version of football that was quite pro-British. I know of people that my parents spoke to who actually were sitting watching the England-West Germany game in 1966, and they thought it was perfectly uncontested to support England. The mascot of those games was a British mascot. There was a way in which the version of Scotland as British wasn't contested.
Since then, the world became very England-centred, and people began to get fed up of being referred to as being English when we were Scottish, or we were only British when it seemed to suit the English. The weather stopped at Carlisle, the news stopped at Carlisle, and that is really when the divide began to appear, and people who previously weren't much bothered about it began to get fed up of the fact that people in Scotland were being ignored by England and by London politics.
Come on in. Find yourself a seat in the straw and make yourself comfortable, but not too comfortable, because you'll be up dancing in just a minute. Hello, everybody.
And when they weren't being ignored, they were being stereotyped by those in charge of the only two available TV channels. The BBC and STV all too often chose to portray Scots as healthy young men in kilts, serenading bonny young lassies in the glens. Or as violent drunks in what seemed like just about every British TV drama ever made.
England's a great country, Danny, once you get to know it.
Well, what can we do for you?
Well, all we came for is to ask you, the only chance did you have to have such a thing as a wee Glasgow man Honda in here tonight?
We've quite a selection, various sizes.
There was a version of Scotland, and my parents articulated this, saw Scotland as an embarrassment, that saw like a bad relative at a Hogmanay party, a drunk doing something embarrassing to your potted plants or something.
2 football matches in a one day. I know a lot of pubs are open.
And I think there was quite a powerful view of that saw Scotland as something to kind of get over, that would be civilised by Britain.
Hello, boys. How's it going?
And it sounds preposterous now. It sounds like wrong on every level is wrong, but people believed that.
I mean, remember, television was Blue Peter, where you had Valerie Singleton on all the time, and people in positions of power and authority spoke posh.
What a bit of bosh at la posh.
Let us examine now some of the more difficult words and phrases that we've used in the residence of the young man's lady friend, or bird, as we say.
What I do remember feeling is a sort of shame or cringe about being Scottish and the way I spoke.
What a bit of...
We're basically made to feel that your culture was in some way wrong.
Is the office work?
Note the word Isiasis.
And if we find that someone's behavioural pattern is tending towards the unorthodox, we might say, is the office bloody chump?
Let's remember the pavilion was full. Let's remember the King's was full with people going to see Ricky Fulton, Jack Mulroy, Jimmy Logan. They were going to the 8:05 shows. Scottish culture was alive and well.
Get a fag.
Many Scots, trying to find their own distinct voice in the 60s, turned to the folk music scene, which was enjoying a huge popular revival. A revival the SNP were happy to support and even profit from.
To keep our branch going, I hit on the idea of chartering the Maid of the Loch. And Hamish Imlach turned up, and he had these two young lads with him. And he said, oh, they're good. And I said, I can't afford to pay anything, but I can give you a half crate of export. That'll do. You know who it was? Billy Connolly. Billy Connolly and Tom Harvey.
Red funnels glow in the sun. Ho, ho, flashing petals, please everyone.
The Big-In was no nationalist, but many folkies drank a toast to the SNP when they doubled their share of the vote in the general election of 1966 to 5%. But there were still more people at Hampden to see the Old Firm Scottish Cup final that year than were voting for independence. But football was to provide the nation with some of its greatest moments of the decade. In 1967, Scotland took on and beat the current world champions in their own backyard.
The game will go down to football history as one of the greatest that Scotland ever played.
While Celtic became the first British team to win the European Cup, defeating Italian giants Inter Milan in the final. And there was more to celebrate in 1967. The newly finished QE2 loomed over apprentices at John Brown's yard in Clydebank as they dreamt of emulating their heroes of Lisbon and Wembley. While the more experienced hands pursued a more traditional pastime. This new ship was designed to be a smaller, faster and cheaper alternative to the great ocean-going liners. In truth, what should have been a triumph of British engineering and design was virtually obsolete before it hit the water. Transatlantic travel by ocean had had its day, and this project was the last such venture to roll down a Clydeside slipway. In the late 60s, the world was a complex and divided place. Race riots swept across the United States before civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Closer to home, the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland also encountered violent opposition. The British Empire, it seemed, was crumbling, as between 1945 and 1967, no fewer than 26 former colonies had declared their independence.
In the new Africa, one more independent country, the state of Uganda.
At home, some people were saying that Scotland should become the 27th, particularly as the crisis in the traditional industries deepened.
A few years ago, there were 16 pits within a 4-mile radius of Hamilton town.
And it was estimated then that about 12,000 people got their living from the mines in one way or another. And now there isn't a single mine active in the constituency.
In Hamilton, the Labour Party moved the sitting MP to a high-paying job at the Hydroelectric Board, provoking a by-election. To contest the seat, the SNP chose an exciting and confident young woman, Winnie Ewing.
Mrs. Ewing, as both a woman and a nationalist, how do you feel you fit into the tradition of Hamilton, a miner's seat?
Well, I've been at 15 public meetings round the constituency, and I don't find any difficulty fitting in. Sometimes, indeed, we've had an almost total response from the hall that they're going to vote for the SNP this time. As to being a woman, I think it's an advantage.
One local party activist was expecting twins at the time, but she didn't let that get in the way of her canvassing.
I remember being in Bellshill Maternity preaching to anybody who would listen about how they really should vote SNP. And they were all, I won't get into the indelicacies of it, but sitting in rubber rings saying, aye, that'll be right, Margot.
A couple of young full-time Labour Party officials headed up from Ayrshire to canvass for the party.
I went up with Charlie O'Halloran on polling day, and we said, now where do we go? You see, oh, come and have your lunch first, says one of the councillors. And I said, how's it going? We weigh the vote here, he says. So Charlie and I finally got a canvas card and out onto the street. And we met. We did. He started at that end and I started at that end. We met in the middle. And Charlie says, we've lost it. And they were sitting in the county buildings, oblivious to what was happening.
Winifred Margaret Ewing has been duly elected to serve in Parliament as a member of the Hamilton constituency.
I'm sitting here with tears in my eyes, as I recall it, at this very hour and minute. It was beyond belief.
It changed everything. It was one of the safest Labour seats in the UK, and Winnie Ewing just overturned this huge Labour majority and a complacent Labour machine. So things were never the same again.
There may have been a carnival atmosphere as the new MP for Hamilton took her seat at Westminster, but Winnie Ewing's victory caused alarm among the political establishment. The Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson announced a royal commission to examine Scottish devolution.
It was knee-jerk reaction, fueled by panic. Panic was what it was all about. Otherwise, they'd never have contemplated it at that time.
The idea of the Labour Party moving conscientiously, nobly, willingly towards self-government and the Scottish society is absolute hogwash.
The Conservative Party.
Then the Conservative leader, Ted Heath, declared his support for a directly elected Scottish Assembly at a speech in Perth.
And we are pledged to give the people of Scotland genuine participation in the making of all decisions that affect them, and to do this within the historic unity of the United Kingdom.
Tories in Scotland were best divided on the subject, so it was an attempt to revive the fortunes of the political party called Conservatives, not just to stop the SNP.
Come and listen to my story about a man named Jed.
But it would take more than a few promises to stop the SNP, particularly when oil, billions of gallons of it, was discovered under the Scottish sector of the North Sea. And oil meant only one thing.
Well, the first thing you know, old Jeb's a millionaire.
The thing that really impacted for me was the Beverley Hillbillies, and that was the story of the family who'd discovered oil in their hillbilly home and therefore could move into Beverly Hills. And I had this sense that oil meant you were going to be really, really rich.
This is the first barrel of crude oil to come out of the North Sea. 1 barrel. And you know, even the most pessimistic of oil men reckon that before much longer, we'll be getting 2 million of these out of the North Sea every day. Top quality, light, Scottish crude oil.
For the SNP, this was all their hogmanay come at once.
We brought in a series of pictures of old age pensioners, of children, of mothers, and workers and said it's his oil, it's her oil, and then briefly gave an idea of how it could be used to cure poverty, to increase jobs in that side of things. And that was a very powerful argument in itself.
But condemnation of the It's Scotland's Oil campaign was swift.
They have always based their case for independence on economic issues. And that greedy, selfish slogan, It's Scotland's Oil, really betrayed any principle behind independence.
The idea that we were part of a United Kingdom until that was discovered, but then wanted to keep it all for ourselves thereafter, I think most Scots realised that wasn't a very impressive ethical position to adopt.
But the discovery of oil didn't mean an instant cash bonanza, as they'd still to get it out of the seabed. And in the early 1970s, Britain was scarred by industrial conflict.
Those in favour, please show.
But none of these disputes captured the public imagination like the radical new tactic adopted by the workers at the Upper Clyde shipbuilders. To safeguard their jobs, rather than going on strike, they locked the bosses out of the yard and continued working.
And we're not strikers. We're responsible people, and we'll conduct ourselves with the dignity and discipline that we have all the time expressed over the last few weeks. And there will be no hooliganism. There will be no vandalism. There will be no bevying.
The charismatic leader of the shop stewards, Jimmy Reid, became the voice of working-class Scotland and the face of industrial resistance. And a bit of a media star too. Even the most famous man at the BBC in London took note.
Well, I'm prepared to volunteer the services of the Clyde workers. We'll build boats, luxury yachts, and we'll fill them full of food and all the rest of it, and we'll send these powerful, important people in British society touring the seas of the world for 6 or 9 months. And you know something? We wouldn't notice their absence unless some society columnist drew our attention to it, because they don't really matter. But let the workers, let the dockers go and simultaneously decide they're having a holiday. And Britain's in the brink of a national disaster. So,
seeing Jimmy Reid on television and being on Parkinson and hearing men with West of Scotland working class accents on television and being taken seriously and people laughing with him and all that was massive.
The workers at UCS saved their yards, but not all industrial disputes can be followed on the telly. Partly because in 1972 there wasn't any power to switch the thing on, as the miners had gone on strike. But as Scotland stumbled about in the dark in the early 1970s, a theatrical light was being switched on, and out of the gloom came something truly memorable. The radical theatre group 784 took their play, The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil, to every corner of Scotland. They told the story of Scotland from the Highland clearances to the oil boom and became one of the most enduring and influential productions ever staged in Scotland.
20, you'll get nothing, I'll get plenty. 21, 22, 23, 24 billion dollars more. 25, 26, 27, 28, watch my cash accumulate. 27, 28, 29, 30, you play dumb, I'll play dirty. All you folks are off your head, I'm getting rich from your seabed. I'll go home when I see fit, all that leaves a heap of shit. You dumb fools, I'm rooking you, you'll find out.
One of the show's creators remembers the impact it made as it toured the country.
The front rows were packed with kids. The older people were near the front to hear better, and the rowdies up the back with a half bottle of hey, whoa, whoa. And so it really crossed the board, and you could tell that every night.
I think there's no question that the culture was ahead of the politics rather than the other way around. And so there was all sorts of different dynamics going on there, and 784 gave voice to that.
Hits the post! Bremner hits the post!
On a cold autumn night in 1973 came triumph on a bigger stage. In front of an audience of 100,000 paying customers, Scotland beat Czechoslovakia to qualify for the World Cup finals. The nation was euphoric.
Referee looking at his watch, and that's it! That is it! Congratulations, Scotland. Well done, boys.
But it wasn't the only stunning and unforgettable victory of 1973. Just weeks after that epic night at Hampden, there was a by-election in Glasgow Govan. The Scottish National Party chose another young woman to fight another rock-solid Labour seat.
I mean, people forget just how dynamic Margot MacDonald was. She could literally stand up on the soapbox and speak to the working class, but also could walk into a university chamber and debate with the best of them. Bright, articulate, charismatic. I mean, just the woman of your dreams.
Govan was a desperate place. And I was so angry that people were living in the most awful conditions. And when people said to me, "You're selfish, wanting to keep this oil money," I said, "Right, come with me. 5 minutes in any direction and you tell me that I'm selfish."
Margot's Labour opponent and odds-on favourite to win the seat was the local barber, Harry Selby.
Now, the price of beer's gone up, you know.
I know.
The price of cigarettes are up.
I know that.
It doesn't even get a motor car, have you?
No,
if you had one, you
not.
couldn't afford the petrol, could you?
Labour was still fighting Tories, basically. And Labour didn't understand that fighting Tories wasn't the way you mobilised voters, wasn't the way you dealt with this new force in town.
On polling day, the Labour vote collapsed, and a massive swing to the SNP saw Margot MacDonald immortalised in the party's folklore. With a general election just weeks away, the centuries-old union between Scotland and England suddenly seemed under threat as never before. Scotland welcomed in the new year of 1974 with a brand new radio station.
Radio Clyde 261, all together now. Sing it to me.
In the meantime, here's a bit of traffic news, all right?
Tartan-clad Edinburgh heartthrobs, the Bay City Rollers, clocked up a string of top 10 hits. In 1974, tartan flares and a matching wrist scarf were regarded by some as the height of fashion. The world, it seemed, was covered in tartan, and anxious not to miss the zeitgeist, the BBC in London commissioned a thriller about tartan terrorists.
We're glad you joined. Right. Just exactly what is it I've joined? Scottish Liberation Army. We're the front line boys. The shock troops, you understand? When the man himself gives the word and the revolution starts, maybe we'll do something big together, right? Then people will stop telling us what to do. And we'll start telling them.
Well, I was writing the books then with a friend of mine called Andrew Osmond, and we hoped, of course, it would be a bit of a stir.
It did that all right. Dramatised by the BBC at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the linking of the terrorist Scottish Liberation Army to the SNP provoked a furious response from the nationalists, even forcing Hurd to write to the Glasgow Herald in defence of his work.
Now, I'm not accusing the Scottish Nationalist Party.
I'm relieved to hear that.
But the movement has always had a fringe of wild men.
Oh, the famous Scottish Liberation Army. I wonder when we'll come to that.
Well, you've seen the reports from Special Branch.
The Scottish Nationalists were very sensitive. The Scottish Nationalists had taken a huge amount of trouble to destroy it, to discredit and destroy it.
They succeeded, and Scotch on the Rocks hasn't been near a television screen since. These were very sensitive times. As never before, the SNP was now a genuine player in UK politics, having won 7 seats in the general election of February 1974, with 22% of the vote.
Scotland is on the march, and a Scottish Parliament cannot now be longer delayed.
For one idealistic Dundee young socialist who just witnessed the SNP's Gordon Wilson take the safe Labour seat of Dundee East, it was all just too much.
Bear in mind that at this time, the Vietnamese people were coming to the end of their victorious revolutionary fight against imperialism. Portugal was throwing off fascism, Spain was about to, Greece had just done so. Our icons were Che Guevara, and how anyone could feel any great affinity to this wee Paisley lawyer in an era of Che Guevara, it really beat me at the time and beats me still.
In the mid-1970s, Labour in Scotland provided a home to just about every part of the left, from Social Democrats to revolutionary communists.
There were Maoists, there was the Socialist Workers' Party, there was militant who were hidden away in the Labour Party. So we spent more of our time attacking each other than we did attacking the bourgeoisie and the ruling class.
To bring this sometimes unruly group to heel and see off the SNP, the new Prime Minister Harold Wilson turned to Willie Ross, his Scottish secretary from the last Labour government. A formidable and imposing figure, Ross had been an army major and was the commander of Maryhill Barracks when Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess was held there after crashing his plane on Eaglesham Moor in 1941. Keeping some trots in check and bashing a few gnats, that was child's play to Willie Ross.
Is the Labour Party worried about the influence of the Nationalists?
Of course we're worried about the influence of the Nationalists, especially their claim that everyone who voted for them had voted for separation, which is utter and absolute nonsense.
Willie Ross was effectively the King of Scotland. And when you were in his presence, as I often was, you felt you were in the presence of the King of Scotland.
Willie was a tremendous orator.
So whatever our differences, whatever our concerns, let our loyalty be to this and to that party.
As a representative of Scotland, he was impeccable.
He was Scotland's man in Westminster. So if he went in and said to Harold Wilson, well, if you don't do this, this will be a complete disaster, everybody kind of gave in because nobody knew any different.
But in 1974, the Prime Minister Harold Wilson believed he knew different.
We've got a job to do. We can only do that job as one people. And I'm going right.
Wilson was running a minority government and another general election was imminent. He decided that the best way to derail the SNP bandwagon and keep Labour popular in Scotland was for them to become pro-devolution again. But the party in Scotland believed in Willie Ross they already had all the devolution they needed.
I think it was the 1967 STUC where McMagarchy got up to argue that the STUC should support a Scottish Parliament. Willie Ross ridiculed McGarchy, saying that Scottish Parliament, I'm your Scottish Parliament, he said. You don't need one, I'm there. The Labour Party can do this.
The Labour establishment in Scotland said, we control this country. We control its councils. We control most of its parliamentary seats. Why should we muck that up? Why should we set up something, the control of which we can't guarantee?
Fear of losing control was everywhere in 1974. Billy Connolly was accused of being beyond control in some of his controversial comedy appearances.
I am headed with my crummock up for great and green to sky, but my journey has an element of farce. 'Cause the calendar has stated it's the middle of July, yet here I am with snow up to my neck. Oh!
Scotland manager Willie Ormond was accused of losing control of his wayward but brilliant squad in the days before arriving in West Germany for the World Cup finals.
Any hangovers this morning, Mr. Ormond?
You can keep your chicken and mouth to yourself.
And Harold Wilson was in danger of losing control of his party. The Scottish executive actually arranged to discuss Wilson's pro-devolution policy on the day that Scotland played a must-win match against Yugoslavia for a place in the last 8 of the World Cup. The lure of live football on the television meant not too many executive members turned up for this vitally important meeting. The Scottish executive chose to defy their own Prime Minister, and the party remained anti-devolution. Stunned by the rejection, Wilson ordered them back to think again. A special conference was convened here at the Co-op Halls in Dallentober Street, Glasgow.
A coming election and the Scottish nationalist resurgence had concentrated and today united the minds of the delegates wonderfully. But the spokesman for the Scottish executive remained defiant.
The squalid populism of the SNP head on, and I'm convinced we would win.
But it was not to be. The big union votes were behind devolution and an elected assembly with legislative powers. And it didn't even take a card vote, so overwhelming were the majorities.
90% expediency. No, 99% expediency.
Expedient or not, it worked. In October 1974, although taking 30% of the vote, the SNP won only 11 of Scotland's 71 parliamentary seats. The domino effect Labour feared hadn't materialised, with industrial Scotland staying loyal, just.
Edinburgh Central with a greatly...
We held the line, and we held the line where it mattered to Labour. That was across the Central Belt, from Dundee right down to North Ayrshire. And that was absolutely critical to us.
Labour struggled mightily to confine us within our boundaries, and within broad limits they succeeded.
As Labour in Westminster celebrated their election victory, secured in many ways on the basis of their devolution policy, the Conservatives were turning to the election of a new leader to replace Ted Heath. No one could have imagined just how much of a game changer this new leader would be.
Suddenly, Mrs. Thatcher was Boadicea and Britannia rolled into one.
We were ruled by a government that had no basis in Scotland.
The Labour Party were bloody silly.
When the Proclaimers went on the tube, it was an unbelievable critical moment in Scottish popular culture history.
The Thatcher government created a much more powerful sense of Scottishness.